Ollie, thank you so much for joining me again. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. So, you might remember last time we talked about the ontological argument. Is it fair to say we decided mutually that it maybe wasn't the best argument for God's existence?
I think so. I think we weren't fans, but maybe we'll see what happens today, though.
Well, that was where my thinking was going actually, because I actually prefer this argument, but we can come on to why that is, and I'd love to hear your opinion. So, we're going to cover the cosmological argument. Maybe if we start with thinking about why it's called the cosmological argument to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. Cosmos, right? The universe, dealing with this quite existential question, I think, really quite early on about why are we here and where are we moving to? It forms part of this much nicer, kind of tighter set of arguments that really challenge what it means to be here and how did we get here. And I think it's rooted in this existential question of the universe, really. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I do think it is quite an existential question, and it gets to the heart of, like you say, why are we here and how did we get here as well? And I think, to be honest, that's why a lot of my students relate to it a bit more because they've asked similar questions. Whereas, again, something like the ontological argument is a bit more abstract, you could say. Maybe we can tie that in then, because obviously, yeah, like you said, cosmos is the universe, and cosmology would be looking at the study of the origins and the nature of the universe. So, again, because that's a very external thing, maybe we can tie this into the fact that this is an a posteriori argument rather than an a priori one. So, should we think a little bit about what makes this an a posteriori argument and how that's different to a priori?
Brilliant. Yeah. So last time, go watch last time. Last time we looked at a priori and we were talking about knowledge before something happens. Whereas this time, yeah, we're dealing with a posteriori. When I'm trying to wrap my head around it, post, right? Post after. Right, so
Yeah.
like a post-mortem. We're looking at what happened after the fact. And that usually means that we have some sort of evidence, whether that's
Mhm.
observable or testable, measurable perhaps. There's some sort of evidence which we gain knowledge from. So in its very nature, it's empirical, which is much better, I think, in trying to grasp in comparison to the ontological, where it's like, if you just agree with me, we'll get there. Whereas this time, there's like stuff we can look at and look at what's happening, and that helps because it's being based on sense experience. And I think that's what makes it so much more approachable, perhaps in comparison to its ontological counterpart.
Really like that point. It kind of, in a way, randomly, or perhaps not, reminds me a little bit of how students feel about Plato versus Aristotle. I feel like a lot of my
Oh,
students, I
yeah.
don't know if it's the case with you, but they tend to prefer Aristotle because he takes more of an empirical approach. So, could we maybe say the same thing with the arguments for God's existence, that maybe students resonate more with the a posteriori arguments, given that they are more kind of externally focused? They're looking at the world around us rather than just trying to deduce things purely based on what we're thinking in the mind.
I would 100% agree with that. I think it's tangibility, right? And what I think is useful as well is obviously for everyone that's studying this at A level,
Yeah.
they've got a good knowledge of GCSE science behind them. And obviously, as part of our courses, we'll study some sort of science part of religion. So this is a lovely connection between all of this prior knowledge and all of this new knowledge, and it kind of helps frame it. You can almost see it within time. You can see why this discussion was happening, and it builds on some beautiful philosophy that's been discussed, and this idea of contingency and necessity, and you can see this inductive reasoning coming through. All
Yeah.
terms that I'm sure we'll clarify. But yeah, I think that's what helps students engage with it. Is the
Yeah.
fact that it's not like the ontological where we're like, right, so get this. If you agree with this definition, if you agree with this definition, this proves God. And it's like, okay, sorry. What?
Yeah, it seems to make a jump, doesn't it, in that
Mm,
sense? And arguably the other arguments do as well, like the cosmological and the teleological, but I think in a different way. But yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I think that idea of kind of looking around at things and that fundamental question, I don't think you have to be a philosopher to wonder how did we get here and how did everything begin? And like you say, it does tie in really nicely with science in a way that perhaps the ontological argument doesn't, but the
Mm.
cosmological and teleological arguments do. So it's a really old argument for those wondering. And I think the person, at least the medieval scholar, most associated with it is Aquinas, but he's by no means the only or the first person to come up with it, but certainly very, very famous. So should we talk a little bit about Aquinas's presentation of the cosmological argument, how he actually puts it across?
Yeah, my spec AQA specifically doesn't require you to know about all five arguments. I know that some do,
Yeah,
others only need you to know a certain amount. I actually get quite frustrated with this because the third way really only works when you understand the first and second.
I'm with you on that. It is a
Um,
bit odd how the different specs only require some or all, and it's not consistent.
Yeah, because I feel that the logic that's part of the third way is shared in the first and second to some degree. So I think Aquinas has to set up what he calls the rejection of the infinite regress. This is a really interesting idea that we somewhat see actually in the ontological argument to a degree in Anselm's response to Gornilo, in that everything in this universe is contingent on something else. So the table that I'm sat at is contingent on the tree that grew and the iron in the ground that was contingent on the drill and the axe. And, everything comes from something. There's a
Yeah.
reason for why it's all there. So to think all the way back, there must have always been something. There's always got to have been something. So to question, well, at some point there was nothing, seems ridiculous because there's just so much now. And it's not just here on Earth, it's across the intergalactic space and time. There
Yeah.
is stuff. There must be something that has always existed. It exists necessarily. It doesn't rely on anything else for its existence. The possibility of the infinite regress, he rejects that and must therefore conclude that some sort of uncaused
Hmm.
necessary being, someone that hasn't got to be created first from something else, must exist in order for everything else to fall into place and come from. The uncaused cause and the unmoved mover are the first and second arguments that we work from. We've also got the cause and effect, and if memory serves, he refers to it like an arrow being shot by an archer heading towards a target, is that we're all moving in this kind of trajectory. So there must be an uncaused necessary being responsible for the existence of all contingent beings, says Aquinas. Therefore, we speak of God.
Yes, there's lots of different ways. There's five in particular for arguing for God's existence. And I think, like you say, if you look at all of them as being interconnected, especially the first three, that's really helpful. So I think the next two ways where he talks about the archer and the idea of guiding the arrow towards its purpose, that could be applied to the teleological argument, the idea that there's
Yeah.
design and purpose and things like that. Certainly for the first three, he talks about, I think, very interrelated concepts. So the first way is called the argument from motion. And when we think
Yeah.
about motion, we're thinking about the idea that something is going from potentiality to actuality. So I think the example he gives is that wood is potentially hot, but becomes actually hot when fire moves or changes it. So motion should be seen as something that's moving or changing. Similarly, with the second way, he's talking about causes. So the idea of an order of efficient causes and the idea that everything has a cause. And what I normally do with my students is say to them, look around the room that you're in right now. Is there anything in here that just appeared by itself? And of course, the answer is always no, right? So that seems quite helpful again to illustrate what he's trying to get across. And then the third way, and you've been using really good keywords there that I think are really important for students, it's the argument from contingency. So the idea that there's a difference between a possible being and a necessary being. So necessary then, again, it's one of those words I think in philosophy that has a few different definitions, doesn't it? Because you could think of necessary as needed, but when we talk about it in terms of existence, it might mean something a bit different. So should we make a firmer distinction then between a necessary being and a contingent one?
Yeah. When I teach it, I think of we all come from parents who
Yeah.
come from parents who come from parents who come from parents. And you can trace that all the way back if you want to go from the biblical angle to Adam and Eve. From the scientific position, you might want to even go back to mitochondrial Eve, depending on the position you're coming from. But their ancestors then came from something, and those ancestors came from something, and those ancestors came from something. We must therefore reach a singular point at which that began. Everything from that point onwards, that's the contingency side. It relies on another thing to bring it into existence. So I use the example of the table, but people are a fantastic example. If parents didn't procreate, then there would never be offspring. There would never be the next human being. Necessity, then, that's where the stretch, I guess, comes in,
Yeah.
is the thing that set it all off, for Aquinas at least, cannot of itself be contingent.
So going back to the terms then, like we say, contingent, I'd use the exact same example. I say to my students, you are a contingent being, I am a contingent being. I like this idea that you mentioned, which is that a necessary being is a bit of a stretch, because as far as I understand it, if we just boil down the argument simply and then bring in this idea of a necessary being, what Aquinas is saying is everything has a cause. For example, a row of dominoes falls only after being pushed. There has to be something acting on it in order for it to set off this chain. There can't be an endless chain of causes that goes back in time forever. In other words, there can't be infinite regress. There must have been a first cause or a first mover. It can only be God. My issue, and this is where I'd like to bring in necessity, like I said before, I say to my students, if you look around, nothing in this room has appeared on its own. Aquinas is saying that's true, apart from for God. God is the only one that is an exception for. So maybe we can talk about that, because for me, that raises some questions. If nothing can cause itself, why is God the exception?
Yeah, and I think we may have already stumbled on one of the potential criticisms, if I'm honest. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that's really answered because Aquinas starts from the position that God exists. It still falls into this same problem that I think most of the arguments for the existence of God do fall into. What I find interesting is this comes up as a criticism from both Hume and Russell. Why can't the universe itself be that necessary being, if you want to use that term? But I think if we want to talk about it from its most standard perspective, and I guess what I would want to see in my own students' work is it ultimately plays on the characteristics of God. God has to be this omnipotent being, and if anything was stronger or existed before him, it would either make him redundant
Yeah.
or not all powerful. And I think this is perhaps where Aquinas had to start in trying to navigate how he can prove the existence of this necessary, unmoved, uncaused being because of his omnipotence and because of his omniscience. And that's a challenge. That's a real challenge to try and navigate for both Aquinas and for us as critics, I guess.
Definitely, yeah. I really like that point actually, because on the face of it, this argument doesn't suppose anything about God. Again, if we compare it to the ontological argument, that's one that rests upon the premise that God is the greatest being imaginable, which is a very bold claim, not necessarily one that everybody would agree with. But actually, this argument does the same, even if it doesn't do so explicitly. So by saying that God is the only necessary being, it does automatically set him apart from everything else and everyone else in the universe. And so we are supposing things about God's nature. It's not just purely this idea that there must be a first cause and it could have been anything. It is saying, no, it can only be God. And
Yeah.
thereby you're concluding that God is actually a supreme being, even if it's not being communicated in that way. So if we go back and look at the steps again for a moment, are there any premises or parts of the argument that we can dispute? Because the idea is that if you agree with his major points, everything has a cause, there can't be infinite regress, there must be a first cause, you should in fact accept the argument. But out of those 3 points, everything has a cause, there can't be an endless chain of causes, there's a first cause, is there anything that we could maybe dispute there or challenge?
I think all of them to some degree can be
Yeah.
challenged. The idea of something needing a first cause doesn't really fit with our understanding today, anyway. Let's first of all talk about the infinite regress. This idea that there's a singularity in time that all things spread from, which I guess from our scientific point of view would be called the Big Bang. But
Yeah.
even now today, we're questioning whether the Big Bang was actually the first thing. And actually,
Yes.
there might be stuff well before the Big Bang. So actually, is it too hard to imagine that things have always just been and that there was never any start of the domino set? It's just the continuation of. I think there's also something to be said about this idea of things always coming from something. If we look at particles in a vacuum, things just come in and out of existence like mad. And we know that, that's observable. So actually, would we say that any of those have a creator necessarily? No. And they are uncaused, if you like, other than the fact that there's a vacuum. We haven't done anything to the vacuum to make them appear or not. It's just observable. I think only on reflection from our modern understanding do we start to see some of these holes form for Aquinas' cosmological argument. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts there.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad that we've brought up science as part of this, because this is the one that on the face of it seems to cohere most with modern scientific understanding, but actually in a way it doesn't, because like you say, when we look at these observations that we've made relatively recently in scientific terms, like for example the Big Bang, and the idea that actually maybe the Big Bang wasn't the beginning of everything, maybe there's the idea of the multiverse, right, and all these other things, the idea that there's been successive universes over time, these things all challenge, I think, what Aquinas was saying. And of course, we can't blame him because obviously nobody knew about the Big Bang back in his day. It was a much more modern theory relative to when he was talking. But I completely agree. I really liked your point as well about infinite regress maybe not being that impossible based on what Aquinas is saying. Because for me, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, it's one of those things where it's really difficult for probably me and anybody to imagine something just going back in time endlessly. But just because it's difficult to imagine, does that mean that it's not possible?
Absolutely. Yeah. That in and of itself is such an interesting discussion to have. It's a challenge because once we reach the Big Bang, what else can be said? Even just getting to the Big Bang can be a challenge. There was someone who said how to bake an apple pie from scratch. You need to start a couple billion years in advance from the creation of the universe to even get to baking an apple pie from scratch. But this idea of the infinite regress is so appealing. Before you critique it from our modern understanding, it sounds like Aquinas has discovered the Big Bang.
Yeah, I know
And
what you
that's
mean.
why it plays into our scientific sensibility. It's only again when you kind of go, well, not really. I think that's what's quite challenging.
I think you're right, because when I've actually presented this to students before and I've said, this idea there must be a first cause, a lot of them have automatically, maybe instinctively, just said, surely we can attribute that to the Big Bang. So an event rather than a being, which is really interesting because it suggests that Aquinas' logic is pretty sound, but actually the conclusion that he's coming to, the idea that the first cause can only be God and it has to be this
Mm.
specific God who is all powerful and is all these other things. There's too much baggage to that to actually make the argument successful. So it might succeed in proving that there was a beginning to everything potentially, but not necessarily that that beginning was caused by God. Maybe this is a good point actually to bring in some of the criticisms of the argument. I
Mm.
feel like we've skirted around them, but maybe to bring them in explicitly would be a good idea. So maybe if we start with Hume actually and then move on to Russell. So what would you say were Hume's main criticisms of not just the cosmological argument, generally arguments based on this a posteriori reasoning?
I always find this interesting because I find Hume as an empiricist
Yeah.
and as a skeptic very interesting that he attacks it in this way. Let's introduce the fallacy of composition because I
Mhm.
mean both Hume and Russell use this. By fallacy of composition, obviously we're referring to parts of something being true may not be true of the whole. So, for example, there are contingent things within the universe does not inherently mean that the universe itself is contingent. Now, obviously, that doesn't always work. So, an example I've got here is each of the 50 states is in the USA. The USA is in the Northern Hemisphere. Therefore, the USA is in the Northern Hemisphere. That's not inherently wrong. So, it doesn't always work. But it's a very challenging idea where actually, how many things do we assume because the parts of something have
Yeah,
those
characteristics or components that, yeah.
characteristics? Yeah.
Russell, in his debate with Frederick Copleston, the radio debate in 1948, he says it's a little bit like saying that each of us has a mother and therefore the human race has a mother. I think that's the example
Yeah.
that he uses, and that there's a jump there. So it's a fallacy of composition, fallacy meaning a faulty line of reasoning. We're assuming something about the whole based on the individual parts.
Yeah, one of my favorite ones is these are little bricks, therefore the wall must be little. I like that one. It just makes me think of a tiny little wall. But
I like it. It's a nice straightforward example as well, isn't it?
yeah, obviously that's not true.
Yes.
You can build a wall to any size using
Yeah.
any size of bricks. So that's really interesting. Every cause has something that started it, but we don't necessarily have to imagine that the universe itself must have had that cause. Hume and Russell both reject the concept of a necessary being. Existence must be based on evidence, what we would call synthetic statements. They cannot be analytic, based on logic. Although it is an a posteriori argument using
Mhm.
evidence around us, there is still no proof, no legitimate evidence that you can point to and say, God. That's a challenge that Aquinas, again, perhaps because he starts from the position that God exists,
Yes.
overlooks.
I think this is something we could maybe apply to all three of the major arguments for God's existence. The idea that they all start with this idea that God can't not exist to one extent or another. And it's not like they're reasoning through these things and they go, aha, wow, look at what I've done. I've proven God's existence. Like starting it from the other way around, which you could
Yeah.
argue is a problem. I really like the fallacy of composition. It's interesting that both Hume and Russell raise that. And also, like you say, this claim that actually it's not possible for there to be a necessary being. And I do think it's interesting, like you say, given Hume's empirical approach, that he's taking issue with this kind of thing. One thing that I think is really interesting is Hume's causal principle as well. And this idea that actually we often think that just because something happens or seems to happen as a result of an effect of something else, it's not necessarily something we can prove every single time. So actually,
Mm.
I think what and I'd love to get your opinion on this, he's kind of questioning that we do actually have a solid understanding of causes and their effects. Would you agree?
Yeah, Hume's question of this, weirdly enough, it's almost like foreshadowing for our own scientific understanding now. As I said, like before, about things popping in and out of existence
Yeah.
in a vacuum. This idea that we have the absolute certainty about cause and effect. It plays into a lot of his other critiques of the argument. He goes on to talk about the necessarily existent being. Well, why can't that be the universe? This cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. I think he even uses some sort of the Occam's razor. If it requires fewer assumptions, well, then why can't it just be the universe? It is reasonable to ask what caused God.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of what Russell said actually, which is that the universe is just a brute fact, which some
Yes.
people I think maybe could look at and be like, well, it's a bit of an oversimplification. But at the same time, maybe that is the case. I feel like this happens a lot actually across the philosophy paper. Any topic that you're doing relating to God's, whether it be his existence, his nature, problem of evil, stuff like that, maybe we're just talking about things that we can't possibly understand. It seems
Yes.
like a bit of a cop out. We can't imagine it, and therefore we're limited, and we're applying our own limited logic to this. But it does seem to make sense, especially when we look at things like the origins of the universe, which, despite all the advances that have been made in science, is still a huge mystery. Then perhaps there is an element of this that is just impossible to know and to understand. But
Yeah.
thanks Aquinas for trying. Given the context in which he was writing, actually, he did a pretty good job of putting forward what I think is more convincing than the ontological argument. But it's good to compare the three of them as well, I think, to see where they rank. But I'd love to hear, as we get to close with this, your overall thoughts on the argument and maybe how it does compare to the ontological and the teleological arguments.
I think we've done a good job, really, not to pat our own backs, of course. I think Hume makes a very valid point in saying that nothing can be said about the nature of God as a necessarily existent being. He says, obviously, it's reasonable to ask what caused God. And it's a little bit like the chicken and the egg thing, which came
Mm,
first. It's all very well and good saying, well, oh, it started with God. Right. Okay. And where did God come from? Right. You can't just
yeah.
say, oh, well, no, that's not how it works. It's a very valid question.
Mhm.
I do find it more convincing, probably because it needs a bit more work, if I'm honest, to untangle. But I do find it more convincing than the ontological for a number of reasons, some of which we've touched on. It tackles a lot more, it fits more within the modern understanding of science to some
Yeah.
degree. I think the fact that there's three of them that form part of the five, each deserve their own respect and have to be treated as such. I think, like all the problems, though, they all, as and we've said this, is that they start from the position that God exists.
I
And
agree.
that's
Yeah.
automatically where we're going to struggle. One thing that I discuss with my students is, to what benefit is it to prove the existence of God philosophically? When we look at the nature of faith, would absolute certainty still bring people to God?
I really like that point actually, because it would undermine faith if somebody were to conclusively prove that God exists. And faith is such an integral part, arguably, of religion. I think most religious people and non-religious people would agree with that. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where everybody looks at the same argument and thinks, right, that's it, we've cracked it. I don't
Yeah.
actually know what it would require, whether it would be an argument or some kind of divine revelation that somehow worked on everybody. I don't know what it would take for everybody collectively to believe in God and know that God exists. It's a really tricky one. We've talked a lot about science in this, and you mentioned this idea that actually seems to cohere a lot with modern science. I do think it's a really interesting point, but one of the things that you said actually made me question what we've been talking about as we've gone through. You mentioned this idea that all the philosophers that present these major arguments for God's existence start with the idea that God exists. I feel like if a scientist did that, if they were setting out to test an idea, the whole idea is they're testing it. They're not starting, or they shouldn't, at least if they're a good scientist, start with the idea that this thing has to be the case. We would criticize that as bad science. And yet, somehow, these arguments, the fact that we're sat here talking about them today, why is it that the philosophers get away with it and the scientists don't?
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? Oh, I might use that. I'm gonna borrow that. Yeah, because in any other discipline, we
Yeah,
would call it bad science or bad practice. And like you mentioned before about a cop out, is the question of, well, is it fair that God gets away with that? Ooh, okay. Oh,
Food
I
for
like
thought.
this.
I know, me
That's it,
too,
yeah.
me too. Yeah, this is why it's great to talk about these arguments. I really like this idea actually that we can sit and talk about these arguments and critique them and maybe come up with criticisms that fall outside of the main ones. Like obviously we've talked about Hume, we've talked about Russell, and they do make some really good points. But it's this cheekiness, if you like, of these philosophers to think I'm going to prove God's existence by saying he can't not exist. Not just science, but like you say, any discipline, if that was going on, I think people would rightly question it. Maybe it's because philosophy in a slightly different domain, or these people are coming at it from a different angle. But I like your question. How is it that we can let God get away with it, so to speak? I'd love to get you back on to talk about the last argument that we haven't talked about, which is the teleological. So
That would be
hopefully
wonderful.
everyone, yeah, will tune in next time and we can talk about that. But yeah, in the meantime, thank you so much and looking forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.